Alright, hello to the fourth session of this class. We'll start with phonology now. For the last three sessions we've been looking at phonetics, which is basically concerned with actual speech signal and articulation and perception, although we only focused on articulation. But now we will look at phonology. And phonology is concerned with the organization of speech sounds in a specific language, and also cross-linguistically what the organization of speech sounds is across languages, which speech sounds are more common than which other, where is what located, etc. But crucially, in phonology we don't look at concrete speech sounds or to the concrete acoustic signal, but rather to abstractions. So phonology is about abstract patterns, while phonetics is about concrete production and the concrete phonetic signal. And the two main questions we'll talk about this lecture is about how do sounds form distinctive units, and what does that mean, and whether there are, and what the regularities are. So we already saw this example between taste and paste, and or sorry, Taste and Paste and Mate and Mappe in German, and we saw that the idea here is, since there is a contrast in meaning between Taste and Paste and Mate and Mappe, then we can conclude that German has these two different units, one which is a T and one which is a P, so T and P, and these units are distinctive. They can contrast the meaning of different words. So we call this phonemes, and we can say that German has these two different phonemes at least, right? And the same kind of patterns can be found in English very easily. So that's an example of doing very basic phonology. So the task of a phonologist is to discover and describe these systematic patterns which are found in individual languages, also to discover general principles that underline the patterns, and what's common across all human languages, what's different, what can be found where. And also another task of phonology is to construct sort of rules that capture phonological systems. So this is a relatively simple representation of word structure. We will get to this. For now it's just a quick introduction. The idea is basically words are divided, are units, and they are divided into syllables. We won't be working with syllables this lecture, maybe the next one. And syllables are divided into segments. We've already started working with segments from the phonetics perspective, but in phonology we can describe segments in terms of distinctive features, and we will come to that. But then, so again, what's the difference between phonetics and phonology? Well, phonetics works on measurable, concrete speech signals and articulations and things in the let's say real physical world. Phonology works on abstract representations and abstract features. It doesn't really deal with sound directly. It deals with abstraction. So we can investigate the functional characteristics of sound units, so like phonemes and allophones. Its objective is to find and analyze these units, and it mostly abstracts away from irrelevant aspects of phonetic units, like the voice quality or some acoustic variations, things that don't really impact on the meaning of these units. So again, summarizing a simple table, physical word versus abstract representation, phonetic signal versus an abstract grammar, and categorization of sounds into classes. Phonetics deals with acoustic measurements, phonology doesn't. And most importantly, the unit of phonetics is the phone, and we've been talking about phones until now, and the unit of phonology is the phoneme. We will be assuming a very basic representation of the mental lexicon. This is a very simplified view of how things work. We will assume that the lexicon is basically a sort of storage room, and we store phonological rules, phonological features, and only abstract representations. So we're going to assume that the lexicon doesn't contain any concrete acoustic information. There is research that says that this view is incomplete, but it's a good assumption for what we want to do in this class. So my point with this is, don't be surprised if people like, for example, Michael Ramskamp then tell you that this view is completely misguided, because this is a simplification, but it's a good place to start. Right. So to recap, what were phones? Phones are individual speech sounds, and there's evidence that they exist. Speech errors in production are evidence of this, and we can transcribe these units, and that's what we learned the previous two classes, the previous two sections. A phone, in contrast, is a segment which provides contrast, and this is an abstraction because we can just ignore the concrete acoustic features of phones, which are not relevant for contrast. So again, to be very clear, phonemes are abstractions. You can have phonemes in sign languages that don't have any sound. Yeah. So sign languages also have phonemes, because phonemes are just abstractions over either sound patterns or sign patterns in sign languages. So, and maybe you recall, I think it was from the first lecture, we saw that phonetic transcription and phonetic elements of phones are transcribed with square brackets, while phonemes are transcribed with slashes and phonemic transcriptions. So how do we find phonemes? Well, we basically find phonemes by looking at minimal pairs, and by finding minimal pairs. And minimal pairs are pairs of words which contrast in meaning and also contrast in one single segment. And this is very important. Minimal pairs are established on the basis of sound and not of spelling. Spelling plays really no role here. It's just about how words sound. And the contrastive segment must be in the same position. So here are some examples from English of contrasts between the and s. You have, for example, zip versus zip. So you have the same orthography, notice, but different sounds. Here you have different orthographies and different sounds between lose and lose. And what this basically shows you is that s and the in English can be contrastive. It changes the word changes its meaning if you change the sonority of the sibilant. So we can conclude that English has two different phonemes, one phoneme for s, one phoneme for z. the same, we can do the same in German. We can see that mein contrasts with dein, and sein contrasts with, for example, nein. And this sort of contrast show that German has at least the following phonemes: the m, d, z, and n. Here are some more examples of contrastive minimal pairs in English, which are basically enough to find most phonemes in English. You should take a look at this in some detail. I won't go through everything, but for example, f versus v can be seen in leaf versus leave, and th versus th can be seen in thigh versus thy, and p versus b in tap versus tap, and the same for all the other sounds. So a quick exercise, you should really try to do this, because this will be a question in the exam. Here are some words in English, and try to figure out some minimal pairs for this, and try to do this for the beginning of the word, and here anywhere you want is fine. So here are some possible solutions. For jail you have mail, for best you have test, for cat you have fat. Here with the vowel you have cat versus cut, shirt versus short, ten versus tan. And beware that that's my those are my Spanish vowels, so the actual English pronunciation is different. Right. We have something important, which is the environment, and the environment is basically the context on which a sound occurs. The context can be many different things. It can be, for example, whether the sound occurs at the beginning of the word, at the end of a word, after a nasal, before a plosive, etc. There's also another relatively important concept, which is near minimal pairs. And near minimal pairs are basically minimal pairs which are almost identical, but there is some difference in the environment. And near minimal pairs are often not enough to determine phonemes. Here are some examples of contrasting vowels in English, but as I already mentioned, I'm not the person to pronounce this, so let's hear them from a person who is. Here's a pretty useful page to hear minimal pairs if you're interested, or if you want to learn English, I don't know, but they have minimal pairs for pretty much every English phoneme there is, and you can hear it here quite well.
Bin, bean, chip, cheap, his, he's, it, eat, sit, seat.
So there you'll have heard the difference in between these two vowels, this E vowel and this E vowel, and then and or that was my attempt at those.
Butter.
So sorry.
Bat, but, batter, butter, cap, cup, cat, cut, match, much,
So it is useful for you to take a look at this a little bit and try to understand minimal pairs, and also try to figure out minimal pairs on your own. That's very important. Yes, so one important point is that you don't need two sounds to be in contrast in all possible positions for them to be phonemes, mostly because there are many restrictions on which sounds can appear in which context. So for example, English doesn't allow an at the end of words normally. So these vowels will never contrast at the end of a word, but that's fine. You don't need them to in order to determine minimal pairs. Phonetic variation of phonemes is quite rampant and systematic. It occurs for most phonemes in most languages, or maybe not most, but quite often. And phonetic variation is often conditioned on the phonetic context. So we already talked about that in the last video, that basically the environment can determine changes to the phonetic realization of a segment. And this often happens because things like assimilation, that two phonemes that are close together will start sharing or sounding similar to some degree. Here's an example. I think I already mentioned it about L, the L sound in English. And basically what you have is that L is, for many speakers, voiceless after a voiceless stop. So it will be voiced after a voice stop and voiceless after a voiceless stop. And many speakers are unaware of this difference. When this happens, we can say that they are in a complementary distribution. And they're in complementary distribution because they never contrast. There is no context in which a voiceless L can contrast with a voiced L, because voiceless Ls only happen in a very specific context and always in that context. All right. So the definition of complementary distribution is that two variants of sounds are in complementary distribution if the variation is a predictable property of the phonology of the language. So L voiced and voiceless is both are in complementary distribution, and because they are in complementary distribution, we can say that those are variants of the same phoneme L. In terms of description, it is often useful to look at which phoneme is most common or happens in the most wide number of possible contexts and environments, and usually we build our descriptions based on that. So we can say that voiceless L happens after voiceless stops and a voice L elsewhere. Yeah, so we base our description around the most common form that happens in the elsewhere position. We describe the specific cases, and then everything else is the most common one. So another way of thinking about this, we can say that the phoneme L will be realized as L, but there are certain circumstances in which it will be realized as voiceless L. And we can call this also allophones, which are just variants of the same phoneme. Right. Regarding representation, we usually use the more predictable one. So for representing both allophones of L, we use the concrete phonetic symbols, and then we use the more predictable one, the elsewhere one, as the representation of the phoneme. Right. So how to test for allophones? Basically, you need to look whether there are contexts where they contrast, and if they contrast, then they are not, and if they do not contrast, then you can say that they're in complementary distribution. However, there's a caveat here. There are often phones which are in what you would call a complementary distribution because they never contrast in the language, but you wouldn't say that they are allophones because they don't share any phonetic features with each other. So if, for example, you found that an L is never contrastive with a sh, well, it would be very rare or weird to say that those are allophones because there are no features in common between l and sh. So usually for allophones to be allophones, you should be able to see some similarities in terms of phonetics. So what units have we looked at so far? So we've started with sound, which are acoustic units, which are measurable, which we can understand how they are articulated. We didn't look at hand signs, but those are also in this category. Then we have phones, which are the individual units of sound. We have representation for those. We use IPA, and we use one symbol for one sound, and everything is written down. And then we have phonemes, which are abstractions over these phones, these units, and which are part of the grammar of the language. And this is I'm sorry if I am repeating myself a lot in this lecture, but this is very, very important. They are abstract units. They are not concrete units. This is a misunderstanding students sometimes have, and which sometimes goes on and on. Phonemes are not sounds. Phonemes are abstract units. So some people like to think of those of phonemes as units in the mental grammar. Other people don't. It doesn't matter. What's important is that they are not concrete sound units. Yes. So again, the same. To remember also minimal pairs. We established phonemes using minimal pairs, and complementary distribution helps us to decide whether two sounds are allophones of a particular phoneme or not. And that's basically it for this lecture. This one was very short, but please do give the exercises a try, and do try to hear the contrastive differences in the website I showed you. This is going to be important for the exam. Also try in whatever your native language is, write down different words and try to find minimal pairs for, I don't know, at least 10 different phonemes in your native language. If it's German, if it isn't, something else. But that's a really important exercise, and hopefully you can check it with the tutors during the tutorials. And that's basically it for this week, I think. Next week we continue on with a little bit more phonology, and if you have any questions or doubts, you can write me an email or go to the tutorial. Thank you.